Hi everybody！ 春节的时候，我看了一个特别好的电影，像很多中国人一样，我看了那个《满江红》，因为我对中国历史非常感兴趣，我非常欣赏这部电影，所以呢，我看完了以后回家要跟我英国的爸妈报道了，到底讲的是什么内容？他们问我那个电影的名字叫啥，我说 Full River Red， 那个英文的翻译，他们的反应很奇怪 ，They're like Full River Red， 有点不对了。And it's true, in English, Full River Red doesn't make a lot of sense. For a river to be full, it has to be full of something, and it has to be full of a noun, not a colour. So even full river of red doesn't make very much sense. In fact, from the English perspective, and 我爸妈是这么理解的, it actually meant the river is running red with blood. 因为英文里面我们常用这句话。Now, that might be the filmmaker's desired effect. 他们也许是要传达这些信息。其实把中文翻译成英文是非常难，而且可以产生很多的误解。而且最近我看了好多这种误解，所以今天我要和大家分享一下，我从一个西方的角度来说，怎么看翻译中文的难点。Why is this important? Well, because we want to understand each other, right? We want to make sure that the information we wish to transmit is transmitted correctly. And so often, and with unfortunate consequences, it very often isn't. So other than 满江红, I want to give examples of how Chinese can be mistranslated into English and cause big misunderstandings, and why that happens. The actual core of why this happens is because the Chinese language has a lot of cultural and historical elements to it, particularly in important areas like art, like politics, like business. The problem is, coming from the West, we don't study Chinese history, virtually at all. Even 受到最高级高层教育的西方人, they won't have studied much Chinese history. I certainly didn't. I don't know anyone in England who has, and America similarly. So, given there are so many cultural references and so much cultural background to Chinese, it's not surprising that there are a lot of misunderstandings. The Chinese language has a huge amount of cultural background with it, in understanding it, making even the best translators scratch their heads. In fact, it may not even be possible to translate some Chinese accurately into English. And for this example, I want to have a poem by Wang Wei, which is called, and many of you will have known it, of course, 鹿柴。空山不见人，但闻人语响。返影入深林，复照青苔上。Hopefully, that was relatively artistic. I did my best, I promise. But why am I picking this? Well, there are tens of translations. I've read over 30 translations of this poem in English, and everyone is different, and everyone has their pros and cons. Let's just look at the first two lines of this poem and the different translations, and I've got a few prepared here. The first translation, no glimpse of man in this lonely mountain, yet faint voices drift on the air. Well, a few problems with that translation. Firstly, he never said drift on the air or make a reference to faint, so the translator has added something here. But also there's a big mistake on lonely, 空. The translation there is probably wrong. Empty does not necessarily mean lonely, which it often does in English, but in Chinese, maybe not, particularly given Wang Wei was an ardent Buddhist, and so for him, 空 or emptiness had a completely different meaning that certainly probably was not just lonely. So the English translation of lonely doesn't gather the whole meaning of what Wang Wei was trying to say. The second translation is another lonely. On the lonely mountain, I meet no one. I hear only the echo of human voice. So again, we have lonely here, but also the introduction of a first-person narrator, I, that doesn't again exist in the Chinese and perhaps shouldn't exist because, again, of the Buddhist element to this poem. Pronouns in English and Chinese are a classically difficult thing to translate, and how do you get around those? Well, the way we get around it in English is by using the passive, like in the following translation. On the empty mountains, no one can be seen, but human voices are heard to resound. Now the problem is we've got rid of the personal pronoun in English, but it sounds dreadful. The passive voice in English is not a poetic voice in general. It's a very clumsy translation, although it is more faithful to the original. Unfortunately, however, it uses words like human voices. Human and a voice is redundant because voices are indeed human, and resound is a strange old-fashioned word. So although this translation is more accurate, it's ugly and doesn't bring forth 那首诗的魅力. It doesn't sound good at all. Finally, this translation: empty hills, no one in sight, only the sound of someone talking. This translation actually is probably quite a good one. It's simple and direct, like the original Chinese. And it also captures the no one, someone dichotomy, which often was in these days in Chinese poem, right? The yin-yang parallelism of Chinese poetry. But even so, empty hills, no one in sight, only the sound of someone talking is not 最高级的英文的用词. So we're left at an impasse. For this poem, it's very hard to transmit both the beauty of the words he is using, as well as capture all of the thousands of years, hundreds of years of meaning that exists behind each of the words he uses. The first two lines are actually even more simple. The last two lines are exceptionally complicated to translate into English because many interpreters believe they are a direct reference to many Buddhist history and religious meanings, which are almost impossible to translate. Why do I choose this? Well, simply to say, Chinese is extremely hard to translate faithfully into English. And why is that important? Because when we speak Chinese and English to each other, we must be very careful to make sure that the person we're speaking to really understood what we're saying. And if we just throw out words without any context, because 对方有可能不理解, it can create tremendous misunderstandings.